Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's SALT Live on LinkedIn session. We're thrilled to have you join us for what promises to be an engaging and insightful discussion around the March 2024 core update. Before we dive into today's topic, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments below. We also encourage you to ask questions throughout the session, and myself and Martin are here to share our knowledge and answer your questions as well as talk about this update. Also, don't forget to follow the SALT LinkedIn page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This way, you won't miss out on any of all of our future live on LinkedIn sessions, and you'll have access to a wealth of resources, past discussions to help further inspire and inform your SEO journeys. So, thank you very much for being a part of our community. So, let's get started to make headway into today's session, and let's try and make it as interactive and value as possible. So, today I am joined by Martin Woods, who is a co founder and SEO director at SALT. Good afternoon, Martin.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me. It's been a while since I've been on a camera, so good to be back. But yeah, interested in the conversation today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for coming on this and for obviously sharing your experience across different things. So, obviously, we're here today to talk about the March core update. And even though it is in the early days, it's only been 3-4 days, I think, since it started rolling out, and core updates can take up to about 30 to actually roll out. Initially, from what we're seeing across Twitter, Reddit, or X, whatever you want to call it, LinkedIn, Quora, Reddit, there's a lot of parallels that can potentially be drawn with the original Panda update from 2011. And obviously, not everybody in SEO has gone through what the original Pandas were, and Panda for most was real time by the time it came around. So it'd be great to understand your thoughts about what Panda was like back in 2011 and how websites were affected similar to they are being now.
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? So I mean, history repeats itself, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. But I think firstly, I can't believe it's that long ago. to be honest, it's a little bit daunting when you're going over a decade. But ultimately, I think anyone working in SEO back then realized that there was going to be a series of measures coming out, not just for content but for other things as well. But really to preserve the quality of what's in Google, and make sure that obviously if you're selling ads and things, you keep your market share. So with that in mind, we always used to work across. When I was working in an agency back then, so we used to work across a large spread of clients, people working in house. Obviously, you might be working on a much more narrowed view, so you might not necessarily have even seen it or heard of it if you didn't come across it. But if you're working with an agency, typically you'd get more exposure because you're working across a portfolio. But going back to the days with Panda, like with many of the updates, because they weren't baked in, they were sort of independent and rolled on set days. You got the usual tremors that I think people still talk about when we talk about core updates, but it was very much regimented. When it happened, oh, you knew about it if it was a big one. And Panda really was one of those big ones where if it didn't affect you, you were kind of blissfully unaware about it. However, if it affected you, then it really affected you. Now, obviously, when something affects you, you have to take stock. So there's no point just panicking and doing things, willy-nilly. Some things have, when it's been a big algorithmic change in the past, when you've been doing various Google dancing, was okay because it was very specific and you knew exactly what the problem was. Everyone talked about on the forums. You knew exactly. Everyone discussed it. You put a plan together. You roll it out. Panda changed that. Panda was awful. If you got hit by a Panda update, you could pretty much wipe away, wave goodbye to that traffic for extended period of time. And because it wasn't a one thing, it was a many thing approach. You'd have sites where you were losing 80%, 90% of your traffic in one go. It's like a sledgehammer essentially. And one of the problems there is because it wasn't a single thing that a site had done wrong. It could be many. You could get caught up in things, especially the larger the website you've got, the bigger the problem. And there was a lot of myths going around at the time, such as the length of your content, the repetition of certain themes of content, duplicate content, all these things, and people doing this knee-jerk reaction. So you'd get people just deleting, whole, swathes of a website in this desperate attempt to try and claw back some traffic. Because ultimately, if you lost 80, 90% of your traffic, and a lot of that traffic was doing something commercially, you're replacing it with something else, and it usually was PPC. So the stress points in businesses, were significant. I know several companies that went under because suddenly they went from a sustainable model that was maybe PPC and organic to a very unsustainable one, which was purely PPC. So you weren't dialing down that cost per acquisition. And I was actually just having a look through some old emails from many, many years ago now, like 2011, that's February. And I'd actually forgotten some of the websites that were hit by, well, I wasn't even referring to Panda. In my head, it's still Farmer Update. Obviously, it wasn't named Panda until a bit later, and then because Google didn't name it when it initially rolled out. But it was that some of the websites that were quite clearly just spamdexing Google with just loads and loads of junk content. And I think that's the whole point of these things, these updates. It's really to protect things. And back then, it was spinning content, it was duplicate content, it was just mass manufactured content. Some of it was manually written, some of it was spun using synonyms and pipes, and there's all that software out there that I think work really well. But the problem is, if you cheat the system, you look for silver bullets, then eventually, when processing power and things become easier to identify, cheaper also to identify, you're kind of on you kind of it's just a matter of time till it catches up. And that's why this particular update is particularly interesting from my perspective, because we've gone over a decade really, and obviously it ran iteratively on its own, but then it got morphed into an ongoing, breathing algorithmic core content quality feature. Now, this is where I think it really takes over and what we're looking for. And I think before we start, a lot of people are running around saying it does this and that and the other, but when we get to these things, it's good to take stock at this point and actually realize what happened before and what happens again, because essentially we've got the same problem. Now it's just AI focused and people are throwing up junk. So it's no different to the old days when the only difference is you could spot it more easily because two pieces of content, you can quite easily see which one has had, pipes thrown in it in a machine, in some software. It's been spun a few times, and it's manufactured content. AI is harder to identify. If it's harder, it might cost more money to process. But ultimately, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about now. The game's changed. Processing power to identify spammers, it's gone up, and people think again. And not even just AI. This is going to be affecting people that probably haven't done AI, and they'll be like, "Well, why has this happened?" But you've got manipulative content out there, and I think we all use the word manipulative, and that can refer to other things like links and things like that. But if you've been using manipulative practices, then watch your back. And as I think we see this unfold, there's going to be a bit of bycatch with this one, because you're going to see people that are getting dragged into this who are probably quite innocent. They just have probably got a bit lazy, rested on their laurels, not looked after their content. Back in the day, we see penalties, manual actions. I always refer to them as manual actions rather than penalties, but algorithmically and manually for all sorts of things: hacked websites, parasite link building stations on you name it, cloaking. It was a lot more prevalent back then. It's not as common now, but some of the things you find are amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just to stress a couple of points to the people watching, that we don't believe this is a reoccurrence of Panda. We're just drawing on the parallels of what Panda impacted back then with how content was, and obviously some of the impacts we're seeing now. And one of the other things you touched on there, Martin, was just around the myths that kind of go around. So AI, Google have already said themselves, AI isn't inherently bad for content production. It's just how AI is used for that. And even going to your point about manual actions now, I'm going to put these briefly up on the screen so people can see it. So at the moment, there's two types of manual action penalties being rolled out. There's penalties around the pure spam. I've shortened this down a little bit because the software we're using doesn't have a full text, but essentially a key part of this for me is the automatically generated gibberish. So that goes for fact checking, actually how that's processed, and even the actual value proposition that content is actually providing. The second manual action that appears to be going around at the moment is that around misleading content. So that's where the site violates the misleading content policy and misleads users to engaging with it. And this is predominantly where the headline, the synopsis, and how it's being presented is actually then being represented within that text. And that kind of goes down to beneficial purpose and other elements as well. So with that in mind, obviously way back when we had things like Unique Article Wizard, we had access to other spinners, and now we've got the generative AI side. Are we potentially looking in some quarters AI content as being the bad thing to confirm our biases versus actually just, as you said, us seeing it as we potentially lost our way, took a few shortcuts, and we actually need to go back to investing in the proper content. I say proper content, a more robust content strategy, and actually focus on content for users as well as for search acquisition.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's no secret doorway pages exist out there, and they still do. And arguably, they still work in many areas. It depends on your definition of what a doorway page is. You could argue categories are essentially a doorway to something, but but certainly not like we're talking about the old days with hidden content and things. There's just been, I mean, repetition, keyword density. These are all assigned to history books many times ago. But every now and again, you still get people bad knowledge. All it takes is someone with a bit of bad knowledge to enter a business, and before you know it, you're optimizing those meta descriptions and some other useless activities. Now, there's the difference between malign things, which essentially they're not going to do any damage, but you're just wasting your money on. And then there's the other stuff where you're going to do some real damage. But if it's not counteracted. I mean, look at some of the tools that Google's released that are absolutely crazily powered. The disavow tool. I mean, okay, nothing to do with the content there, but in the wrong hands, you can kill a website. For probably forever. Some of them, the way that it was done. And I think this is one of the concerns with these updates is that knee-jerk reaction. But essentially, a website is no different from a shop front in a traditional sense. Shop front, if you're running a bar or a cafe or a restaurant, every now and again you need to do a full refurbishment. And often people maybe they change stack, they do that, but often some of that content that gets moved over. People just go, oh, it's okay, it's the blog or so, and it gets lifted and shifted multiple times without really addressing if it's still accurate, relevant. If it's do people even read it? And there's a lot of people don't really give content it's real. It's real added value on websites. It's just taken as a given. It's a website, it's got some content. And I think this is a wake-up call to a lot of people and a lot of businesses that actually, you can't cheat the system with content. You have to invest in it and you have to keep reinvesting in it. And that's not doing it from that AI thing. But I think a lot of people are going to be surprised that I think you're going to see a lot of websites caught up in this that aren't AI. It's just really, old stuff. And back in the day, Panda didn't just affect one page. It took you down. With a fight. But it took you down, and it affected that. It was that mass side, and obviously there's different levels. You've got pure spam, which is obviously the worst. In terms of an action. But these are manuals. But you can also get the algorithmics, and the algorithmics were probably the hardest because at least if someone tells you a message in search, I remember when you used to have to, it was outside. You have to message to get a confirmation. There wasn't such a thing as just a search console webmaster tools back then. But I'm showing my age there. I still call it that. But it's like that's a real problem. Algorithmic versus manual. At least when someone's just told you've been naughty and gives you an indication really of where to look. Algorithmic's worse because then that's a needle in a haystack territory, and you're scrabbling around for a glimpse of something to cling on to and some hope. And there's a lot of websites never recovered. So I think that's I mean, someone deaf. I'm just seeing that ticker at the bottom, Dan. Someone else still calls it webmaster tools. I don't like change, but it's but on a serious note, I think the main thing to do is actually take stock and think about why these algorithms even get rolled out. And that on a very basic level, it's to protect the quality of search results. And if you've got junk, Google doesn't want that, and it's certainly not going to go to the top. And we all know that quality content, you can rank websites, just through amazing content, a spattering of technical and a couple of helpings of inbound links. Job done, right?
So kind of touching on the base then of, like you said, the glimmer of hope and moving on, because Panda was very much content quality based, it was focused around that and those pure spam manual actions and the algorithmics that kind of went out with it. How did websites go about recovering from Panda, both Panda version 1 and the iter of Pandas moving forward?
Well, I think there's a difference between trying to recover and actually recovering. I think some of the sites that we saw. I mean, you saw news sites get caught up in it all because you know all they were doing really was training algorithms against matching what running an algorithm would look like on the index, and they were comparing that to manual reviews of websites. So you get manual raters looking at the quality of websites and say, would you trust this content? I mean, essentially, it's just the precursor, isn't it, to EAT and all that stuff, because it's the authority and expertise. It's not rocket science, that stuff. But the problem is that you didn't really know, because a big website, people making drastic decisions, no indexing products, all products on a website to see if that did something. I mean, it's experimental days. I mean, what was it? Some of the other crazy things. I mean, people tried to move domain to try and escape it. That was a good one. You see, it was some wacky ideas going on at the time. I think the real success I've seen was really a change set in the mindset of how you treat content on a website, and actually not thinking that what used to work's still going to work. Essentially, spam indexing, that's a big part of it. And obviously, if you go back to if you go back to Word before you started mentioning Panda, you started talking about that farmer update. That's what it was doing. It was people who essentially farmed content to make money, and people made millions out of junk content, millions and millions and millions. And that's one of those areas where we need to take stock on, because just having loads of pages on a website is irrelevant. Are they doing something? Are they up to date? Misleading content is dangerous, isn't it, really?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the misleading content manipulation that's going out there is quite, in my opinion, it's a quite valuable one that Google's needed to add for some time. Again, I'm just going to throw what the actual wording of a misleading content manipulation is for those who haven't seen the screenshots on Twitter. So, even though there's a difficulty in recovering and kind of elements like that, how would you speak to either SEO managers in house now or business owners watching this who might have concerns around what their content strategy is looking forward, how it's going to weather any future Google updates like this, and even tying it back into generative AI and how Google's AI is going to change this? What would be your kind of like next steps to weather this storm and make that defensive content strategy?
So if you haven't been affected, and if you have been affected, I'll probably treat it slightly differently. So if you haven't been affected, then you probably still need to do some housekeeping. So you should be doing that anyway. Everyone's got that room in the house they just bundle junk in and shut the door, and then every year they put a bit extra in, and then suddenly one day the door doesn't shut anymore. Well, unfortunately, it's probably time to start putting a plan together and some resources to address that cupboard that sits in the corner. That's a no-brainer, really. If you have been affected, the first thing to do with any kind of update, and now it used to be when algorithmic updates happened on certain days, and it still is the case now, because obviously since caffeine, it's relatively quick, right? It's not just a couple of times a year and then you're dance like mad. And first thing to do is align stuff, make sure that actually what you're talking about. Now, we did loads of this when we started SALT. We got a reputation for dealing with penalties back then. We dealt with hundreds. Even understanding how people couldn't get out of them, and so it's understanding it. I mean, this isn't anything to do with content, but it's understanding how that algorithm has affected you, and not just making stuff up because you think it isn't a gut reaction. So, I mean, this is nothing to do with content. This is Penguin, but Penguin, and disavows. If you didn't understand how the process of getting out of a manual action from a link penalty, you'd just be grasping at straws, wasting your time. Now, obviously, the bigger the website, the more links you have, then if you're disavowing things, for example, or doing those kind of activities, your sample size of the links that validation that you've done enough work to get out of a penalty is going to be smaller. So that rotates 2-3 times, in a week. So if you update something and you're waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks, that the data that's going to be used to corroborate, your story that I'm clean and I've removed the offending products, it's going to change and rotate. Now, the same theory behind these things applies to any core update. You correlate the dates, you make sure you have a full picture before you start having a strategy. Then you read, then you compare notes with fellow people, and then you come to a conclusion of a wider sample than just yourself. And that's why forums, super important. Obviously these days, you've got social media as opposed to web forums in the old sense. So people are more collaborative. Talk, share information. That's how we all unpick these things back over 10 years ago now, isn't it? It's 13 years ago. But that's your starting point. Then produce a strategy that matches the statements put out by Google. So read between the lines. If Google puts out a statement, it's because they want to see change. They want things to happen, and their protector index. So read between the lines is my thing. So read the statement that gets put out. Read between the lines. Extrapolate the main themes of that to really understand what's been baked into it. So, and I think that's in the old days. Obviously, you get Mac cuts, etc. Basically being quite helpful and telling you where to look and things. It's the same these days. What Google want is they want great websites with great content. What they don't want is loads of thin, website. Well, just before I was just going through some old emails, and I'd forgotten some of the litter that was out there on the internet. We used to have like e-zine articles and things like that, which for anyone that's watching this would be like, yeah, right, that was horrendous, wasn't it? But if you don't know what that is, and you maybe not been in the industry that long, Google it, and go back, use the Wayback Machine and have a look at some of the junk that was out there. That's where we've been moving from. So every time technology changes and it increases the likeliness of being spammed, look at how it's doing. I mean, those days was easy because you could look at synonym usage and you could compare and contrast. But it's for these kind of updates, before you do anything, and you need to really step back, and you need to think of it from Google's perspective, and you need to look at pages on an individual level, see how they've performed, but then also look, group them. Don't just look at pages individually and then the website as a whole. That's not going to get you anywhere. What you need to do is you need the theme of the pages. You need to look at, it might be even the category. It might be the author. If there's a particular author there that's done some dodgy work. We all know that there's a lot of things on the internet that don't have authorship, and obviously we had rel author came and went, and now obviously Google can understand authorship in different ways, and you don't have to do reciprocal linking through I think it was Google Plus back in the day, wasn't it, to wire it all together, to stitch that content and validate it. The reciprocal side of a two-way link. I mean, it's validation that yes, I did write that content. There's different ways of doing that these days, but the main thing you do is you look at the data, you correlate the times, you speak to other people, ideally in your own niche or niche. It's because they are different. They can affect different sectors. Look at during COVID when that broke out, the content shifts and what Google was allowing in the index high up in the search things, it changed it, didn't it? For anyone that worked in the pharmaceutical sectors, we went from opinion-based random websites just offering advice to medical dissertations, factual stuff. And obviously there's a reason for that. Is because Google's trying to protect its users from bad information, right? That's the same thing, and that's ultimately what we're talking about. Is Google wants to protect its users, its customer base, because its customer base has a value, its market share has a value. So with that in mind, you compare notes, put together a strategy, and you address it. And you're not going to be able to address if you've been hit by this. If it was anything like Panda, it's not an overnight thing. You're going to be doing this. You need to ask for budget probably, because most businesses don't have surplus capacity. Most large businesses to go through very, very large portfolios of content that have built up over the years. We work with sites which they're millions of pages, URLs, URIs. I mean, that's millions and millions and millions. So if you're in one of those positions, that's going to be harder than a few thousand.
No, absolutely. On that slightly more solemn note, we don't actually have any questions from the chat, so we'll give it about 10, 15 seconds or 30 seconds if someone wants to throw any out there. So like you said there, you're probably going to ask for budget, you're probably going to have to readdress a lot of the strategy. If you have been hit by this, or you have concerns that you've been hit by this, what would you look to actually start to unpick whether or not you need to start having those conversations? Would it be Search Console Webmaster Tools? Would it be your actual GA, GA4? Where would you start to look to actually start to build that business case?
Well, I mean, Search Console, that's the strongest, isn't it? The main reason for that, obviously, you've got the keyword data there, in its it's in its entirety. So you can then maybe build some themes. I mean, you've got a lot of stuff. You've got a lot more tools at your disposal than 2011, February 2011. The game's changed. You've got 18 months in Search Console of keyword, of URL. You've got a lot there to play with. Obviously, first things first. Probably want to check your notification section to actually make sure you haven't got a manual. But sometimes, believe it or not, worked on very large websites where no one even realised that they had a manual action, and that's not that many years ago. That's only a few where people just were oblivious, and big companies, NASDAQ, FTSE, these are no one really had it set up correctly. No one got the alerts. So yeah, that's probably as a starting point. And then I'd probably start, if it was me, I'd these days, make a little data lake, put it all in there, depending on how big your sites are. Get it all stored in the database correctly, so you can pivot it. Don't start as soon as you remove data, you can't get it back again. So hoard it all there, and then overlay that with performance, and see if you can see any trends. This is where AI can come in, because actually what you can do is you can build the data set, and then you can actually get AI to put, let's say, all the keywords into categories. So you can actually, rather than doing that manually, which will take you I don't know, on a big website, weeks, and miserable job, right? Actually, get AI to do some of the heavy lifting, get those keywords in, get the sentiment of those keywords, because you might find, and obviously it's early days, but you might find that you haven't lost traffic on the intent of some keywords. You've lost it on others, and the main reason for that could be something so simple as that page that was designed for one intent. You were capturing other stuff. And then I suppose really the other thing is, you lost traffic. So what? It might even not be relevant. If it's not relevant, if you haven't lost conversions and revenue, are you bothered? Maybe not. Unless it's doing something else, like, I don't know, it's linkable content, evergreen content, it's attracting links, and it's doing something else that's adding value from search engines. But yeah, if it's not actually done you any damage, I think the best thing ever was a website I worked on where it ranked #1 for Facebook logo. It was all, it lost 40% of its traffic overnight, and you know what? It was okay. In fact, the server costs went down because not everyone was coming in and just copy and pasting, Facebook logo off it. So actually, it wasn't the alarm bells that everyone thought it was. It just was the wrong website ranking for something. So sometimes not a problem.
No, absolutely. So it's about hoarding the data, being vigilant, and actually understanding your risk. On that note, I think it's a good time to close off. Just before we say goodbye and thank you to Martin, I'd like to thank everybody who has come along today. The concurrent viewership has been positive, and thank you for taking time out on a Friday. Now, please do remember, if you want to keep up to date with the SALT LinkedIn live on LinkedIn sessions, please go ahead and follow the SALT LinkedIn page, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel where all the playbacks are uploaded to, along with other webinars we do that are both in-night and also just in general content. So on that note, I want to say thank you, Martin, for your time and for sharing the insights.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for dialing in. If anyone has any questions, please reach out to us. If not, have a great weekend, or depending on what time you're playing this back, have a great morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you and take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.